The early 20th century was a wacky time to be alive. From trains, janky planes, and some of the most unreliable automobiles ever made. This area between 1910 and 1914 was a time of innovation. However, poetry was not keeping up with the times. While I'm talking, the whole world was in the 1910 equivalent of Cyberpunk 2077, these poets were still your grandmothers sitting in their rocking chair reminiscing about the 500-mile drudge to school that was uphill both to and from. Many of these poems were borrowing from the now old and pretty much defunct Victorian themes of love and pretty environments. However, soon a shift would come that not many would expect in the form of global tensions and Ferdinands riding around in convertibles. Bang, shoot, boom. Look at all these happy, upbeat faces. Just kidding. These people were all miserable. That's what fighting in a trench does to your mind when all around you is death and destruction. One particular poem you might recognize from this time is In Flanders Fields. And to give you a general idea of what people were thinking about when sitting in a trench is that when John McCrae wrote In Flanders Fields, he was sitting in the front lines recalling the dead and dying. This was a common theme. The concept of disillusionment and how people felt through the world was turning for the worse. And on top of that, most poems were not even being published. So these poems did not become popular until after the war when poems began to be published again. With the end of the war, people were very happy and cheery. Their egos were horribly inflated. At the time, most people were very patriotic and completely stupid. In fact, the anti-German sentiment post-World War I resulted in this interesting thing called prohibition, in which beer was considered bad, and because there was alcohol in beer, it too was bad. It was so ridiculous, in fact, that America forcefully made all sauerkraut companies change their packaging to say Liberty Cabbage, and even hamburgers became Liberty Steak. However, for poets, the new style was to be new and funky. This introduced increasing amounts of new styles, wacky types of poetry, and things that added things like imagery and symbolism, including rhyme. This also included forbidden subject matter, like men and women talking in a public area. How scandalous. This time also saw the beginning of the popularity in poetry journals, the perfect table book to rest your coffee on. Pretty self-explanatory. There was depression, and it was great in size, not in morality. Poets were out of money and patience for trying to make money, but those who stuck around often wrote about things like loss, sadness, and general despair for their current situation. A popular poet of this time was one William Epson, who wrote the poem Missing Dates, in which he reflects on his debt and the poets who came before him and inspired him to do the work he was doing in this time. World War II. Despite the thousands of people who think it's cool, it was not cool. Poetry of this era reflected that. A good example of these ideas are expressed in a 5-line poem called The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner, in which a story is told of a human being who died in his gun pod on board a bomber. Naturally, the author Randall Jarrell was a radio command post operator for the US Air Force, in which his position meant he could often listen in by radio to how the pilots and crew were reacting in the skies as enemy planes surrounded them. This is the poem.
From my mother's sleep, I fell into the state, and I hunched in its belly till my wet fur froze. 6 miles from Earth, loosed from its dream of life, I woke to black flak and the nightmare fighters. When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose.
This poem, as I said before, tells the story of a ball turret gunner who in flight reminisces of his past life at home while asleep, before the cold air uphands him and snaps him back to reality, and he awakes in the nightmare situation of a bomber crew, which is unfortunately his reality. He eventually ends up getting killed by an enemy fighter, and his body is so horrifically destroyed that he is washed out with a hose from the inside of the gun pod. I feel that the fact this poem is so blunt with how it puts its emotion with how short it is, conveys that in war, one death is not that important to the situation of anything, but it is merely to be washed out. This began the rise of the era of the Red Scare, where diplomacy between World War II allies began to deplete and become more hate-fueled. However, not much happened in terms of poetry, as this year was a stale year, mostly filled with a consumer-driven market. One notable thing, however, is the fact that Canadian poet James Rainey won the Governor-General's Award for Literary Merit. This is when we begin to see the breakdown of modernism, and the idea that things aren't going to fix themselves and that not everything is on the way up. With America's involvement in the Korean War, many Americans began to go overseas to fight a war that people did not believe in. While America decimated the landscape with tanks, bombs, and planes, many at home wrote about the horrors and emotions that were being driven by those to say that it's not only America not great, but that the actions they were committing are heinous and doing nothing more to help than show America as a place where diplomacy dies at the threat of communism. A good example of poetry from this time is A Spoonful of Rice by Hai Dong Chai. There's a lot to unpack here, so I'm going to split it up into many different sections which fall under this era. During this time, there was of course the Vietnam War, in which Americans had become fed up with their own government's consistent willingness to go to war because of other countries' businesses, as well as those who just wanted to see their loved ones make it home after being drafted. Many of them left only with an MIA letter on their nightstand and their memories of what their family members were like. Racial inequality. In 1967, after the death of cab driver John Smith from being shot by the police, African Americans, after being discriminated against for over a century in both schooling, housing, and being put down by the United States government, rose up, resulting in a total of 159 race riots over the summer of 1967. This has come to be known as the Long Hot Summer of 1967. This would lay the foundation for all political uprisings in the future. 1962 also began with a rocky road, as tensions between the USA and USSR led to all-out hell, with both sides placing nukes in close proximity to each other in hopes of a power move. This began the Cuban Missile Crisis, which arose many political ideas in people, starting the beginning of the nuclear family. In this era, we saw the beginning of the hustle and bustle of modern life, where the increase in fast food and TV dinners created the idea that people can work, buy a cheap, fast dinner and take it home, and relax until the next day starts. However, this would not have the wished effect, as we will see later. Poetry was not very prevalent during these times, except for a few occasions. In this time frame, the rise of computers began to take control, as well as drugs and rebellion. This was also the second major rise of feminism in the 20th century, where women, after being treated poorly in a male-dominated business, rose up against them. This would take place until 1997. Unemployment also skyrocketed, leading to the end of the nuclear family. After the 80s, with its rocking and fight against the man, people would discover how much businesses and overall quality of life declined over time. This time was the rise of the internet and ad campaigns, and with the fall of the Soviet Union, trade became more open all around the world, allowing for more freedom and expression of art. This helped boost the poetry industry, but most poetry still revolved around political issues or infighting. I know this is a very large section of time to elaborate on. However, I feel out of anything, poetry has changed the least in this era. Most of poetry revolves around ideas developed in the modernist era, but turned into the embodiment of political injustice, as it seems now all poetry written today is about how society is putting one group of people down, or how this thing is not fair to this group of people. And I feel something needs to change. But with the rise of the highest recorded amount of mental issues in the history of society and businesses abusing people around them, I do not think we're going to see that change anytime soon.